Someone took her shoes. Not her coat. Not her bag. Not anything that made logical sense to take. Just a pair of brand new lavender shoes off the feet of a 9-year-old girl. And whoever did it kept them. Deliberately. That one detail, that single dark and deliberate act, would haunt an entire city for 51 years. Because the man who took those shoes walked away completely free. He lived his life. He breathed fresh air every single morning. He sat at dinner tables and watched television and slept in his own bed while a family across town stopped sleeping entirely. While a mother kept every newspaper clipping she could find. While a father went to work every day carrying something behind his eyes that never once left him. While a 10-year-old boy grew into a grandfather, still waking up in the middle of the night asking himself the same question he had been asking since 1972. Who took her? Tonight on Midnight Crime 247 we are going to answer that question. This is the story of Deborah Lynn Randall. And it is one of the most extraordinary cold case resolutions in American criminal history. If you are new to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a drop. Hit the like button before we even get into it. And leave a comment below telling us what city you are watching from tonight. We read every single one. Now let us go back to Marietta, Georgia, and to a Thursday evening in January that changed everything. It was the 13th of January 1972. Marietta was a different kind of world back then. Neighbors knew each other by name. Kids walked to the corner store alone without a second thought. Nobody locked their doors before dark. It was the kind of town where trust was still the default setting and fear had not yet moved in and changed the locks. A parent could send a child half a block away and feel completely fine about it. That is important to understand. Because what happened that evening was not the result of carelessness. It was the result of a world that still believed it was safe. Debbie Randall was 9 years old. Third grader at Pine Forest Elementary. Freckle-faced, full of a kind of energy that the adults in her life called electricity. She did not walk into a room. She arrived in it. Family friends who visited the Randall home always brought dolls, not because anyone told them to, not because it was expected, but because they knew it would pull that wide, unstoppable smile across her face the moment she saw them. She was the kind of child who made every room feel louder and warmer just by being in it. But there was another side to Debbie that people do not always mention. She was the undisputed queen of the neighborhood baseball team. Tough. Competitive. Completely fearless on the field. And the person she loved going up against more than anyone else in the world was her older brother Melvin. 10 years old. 1 grade ahead of her in school. Her closest friend on the planet. Those two had something between them that you only get with siblings who actually like each other. The kind of bond that shows up in the way they talked and laughed and competed and annoyed each other and came right back together anyway. That Thursday evening Melvin was sick in bed. He had a fever. The family's laundry needed a run to the Duds and Suds laundromat barely half a block from their apartment. There was a show on. Melvin stayed behind. He would spend the next 50 years wishing with everything he had that he had gotten up anyway. Debbie's stepfather Frank walked with her to the laundromat. He loaded the family's clothes into 2 machines. Got them running. Handed Debbie a coin so she could switch the loads when the first cycle finished. Then he walked home. It was half a block. She was a child who knew every inch of that neighborhood. The machines needed another 40 minutes. There was absolutely no reason in the world to worry. That was a completely reasonable decision made by a completely reasonable parent in a world that still felt reasonable. But somewhere out there that evening a man in a dark pickup truck was already watching. Inside the laundromat Debbie did what Debbie always did wherever she went. She played. She stacked empty detergent boxes into little towers and knocked them down. She talked and laughed with the other girls nearby who were folding their clothes. Time moved the way it moves when you are 9 years old and nothing in the world has ever told you to be afraid. Then at 7:15 in the evening Debbie stood up. She looked around at the girls inside the laundromat one last time. Said goodbye. And pushed open the door. That was the last ordinary moment of her life. A 12-year-old girl was standing outside near the building. She saw a man grab Debbie. Watched it happen in real time right in front of her. But she did not scream. She did not run for help. Because her brain did what most brains do when they see something confusing in a familiar place. It made an assumption. She thought she was watching a father grabbing his misbehaving daughter. So she stayed quiet. She waited. She watched. Then the truck moved. Fast. Reckless. Tearing away from the curb with such force that the 12-year-old had to jump backwards to avoid being struck. As the truck accelerated away, she caught one final glimpse of the driver in the rearview mirror. He was not panicking. He was not rushing or looking away. He was watching her. Calmly. Steadily. Measuring her from behind that mirror. Deciding she was not going to be a problem. Then he was gone. The street was quiet again. And a 9-year-old girl in brand new lavender shoes was gone with him. By 7:30 Debbie had not come home. By 8:30 her mother Juanita could not wait any longer. She walked to the laundromat herself and an employee told her that the little girl had left well over an hour ago. Juanita moved fast after that. And in a parking lot directly across the street from their own apartment she stopped walking. On the ground in front of her was a spilled box of laundry detergent. And on the side of a Volkswagen Beetle parked nearby were small handprints. Child-sized. Smudged downward. As if small hands had been pressing against the side of that car while being pulled away from it. A second witness later confirmed they had seen a dark 1950s pickup truck backed up to that exact spot around 7 in the evening and watched it tear away at speed. The truck was already long gone. And somewhere inside it was a 9-year-old girl in brand new lavender shoes who had just waved goodbye to a room full of strangers thinking she was simply going home. Melvin lay in his bed that night. Sick. Completely unaware. He did not know that the last time he had heard his sister's voice was the last time he would ever hear it. He would not find out who took her for 51 years. John Randall got the call at the Ford Motor Plant and left without a second of hesitation. Within the hour the entire family was moving through the neighborhood in every direction. Knocking on doors. Calling Debbie's name. Retracing every step she might have taken between the laundromat and home. And Melvin got out of bed. Fever or no fever. He pulled on his shoes and went outside into the dark. A 10-year-old boy still sick going door to door through the neighborhood asking every single neighbor the same 2 questions. Have you seen Debbie? Do you know where she is? Every single person said no. But they also said they could not believe it. Not Debbie. Not here. Not on this street. The Marietta police arrived quickly. Officers documented the fingerprints on the car. Noted the spilled detergent. Took statements from both witnesses. The 12-year-old's description combined with the adult witness helped investigators build a composite sketch of the driver. But a sketch is just lines on paper. And the truck was already gone. What happened next in Marietta is something this city has never fully been given credit for. They called it Operation Debbie. More than 4,000 volunteers mobilized. 4,000 people who had never once met the Randall family. Who simply could not sit at home knowing a child was out there somewhere in the cold. AM radio operators built communication networks across the entire county. Civil defense workers coordinated search teams through surrounding neighborhoods and wooded areas. The Concerned Citizens Committee organized grids and kept people moving through the dark. And moving through all of it, still knocking on doors, still walking streets he had already walked twice, still going was Melvin Randall. 10 years old. Holding a stack of flyers with his sister's face on them. Talking to strangers. Asking questions. Refusing to stop. At home, Debbie's baseball bat leaned against the wall exactly where she had left it. Nobody moved it. 5 days passed. Then 10. Then 2 full weeks of silence with no credible sightings, no confirmed leads, and nothing that brought investigators even one step closer to the man in that dark pickup truck. The 29th of January 1972 arrived cold and gray and raining steadily. The kind of rain that soaks through every layer and makes the world feel heavier than it already is. A group of Southern Technical Institute students were still out searching. One of them was a young man named Mike Mahan. A Vietnam veteran who had come home from the war and enrolled in school trying to build something resembling a normal life on the other side of everything he had seen. He had experienced things overseas that most people never have to encounter. He was still not prepared for what he found. After several hours moving through heavy trees near the Fox Hill subdivision on Perry Road, Mike Mahan stopped walking. There were drag marks in the mud ahead of him. Long and deliberate lines cut deep into the wet ground heading further into the trees. He followed them. About 1,000 feet south of Windy Hill and Perry Road. In the mud and the rain and the silence. He found Debbie Lynn Randall. She was fully clothed. Only her socks remained on her feet. The lavender shoes were gone. Someone had removed them and kept them. Deliberately. That one detail tells you everything you need to know about the kind of person who did this. This was not panic. This was not impulse. This was a man who stopped. Who made a decision. Who took something and walked away with it. Dr. Larry Howard of the Georgia State Crime Lab confirmed that Debbie had been sexually assaulted and that her cause of death was strangulation. Investigators believed her killer had used her own coat to silence her during the attack. Then a geologist analyzed the soil found on Debbie's clothing, and what came back shifted the entire investigation completely. The dirt came from 2 entirely different locations. One matched the dump site where her body was found. The other matched a specific clay composition from the Dixie Cast and Stone Company on Powers Ferry Road roughly 3 miles away. Debbie was not killed where she was found. She was killed somewhere else and then moved. Her killer had time. He had a plan. He knew this area well enough to choose 2 completely separate locations with intention. This was not panic. This was calculation. 2 pieces of evidence were recovered near the body. A strand of brown hair. Lab analysis determined it came from a white male likely between 18 and 30 years old. And a small circular piece of cloth with a floral design on it. Both were carefully logged. Both were properly preserved. And with 1972 technology, both were completely useless to investigators. Thousands of people packed into Roswell Street Baptist Church for Debbie's funeral. The crowd overflowed into the street outside. A city that had spent 16 days searching now gathered in a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls of the building. Debbie was buried at Kentstone Memorial Park. And her killer went home. Closed his door. Went on with his life. Completely certain that the case was going cold and the trail had ended with Debbie in those Georgia woods. He was almost right. But he made one mistake. He left something behind. And it was waiting for him with infinite patience. The 4 detectives who worked this case in 1972 were not careless men. Lieutenant Bill Hudson, Major Tim Buckley, Captain Bill Elliott, and Lieutenant Ray Owens followed every lead that came in. Hundreds of tips poured in from across Marietta and Cobb County. Every single one was tracked down. Every single one was checked. Every single one went nowhere. The composite sketch never led to an identification. The dark pickup truck was never traced. The witnesses gave everything their memory could possibly hold. It simply was not enough. But before those detectives moved on, they did something quiet. Something that would turn out to matter more than anything else they could have done. They preserved everything anyway. In 1972, with no database to search and no technology to analyze what they had recovered, they sealed that evidence properly and stored it carefully. The strand of brown hair. The small circular cloth with the floral design. Every piece of physical evidence from the scene logged, stored, sealed inside a box that was addressed without knowing it to the future. To investigators who did not yet exist. To technology that had not yet been invented. Those 4 detectives could not have imagined that what was inside that box would one day speak louder than any witness who ever came forward. Years passed. Then decades. The Randall family lived inside the silence. Juanita kept every newspaper article ever printed about Debbie's case. John carried something behind his eyes that never fully faded no matter how many years went by. And Melvin grew up. Built a life. Raised children of his own. Watched his hair go gray. Became a grandfather of 2. And still woke up some mornings with the same weight pressing against the inside of his chest. Who took her? If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now and type "still here." We want to see who is truly following this story all the way through. Every single comment you leave helps this channel reach more people who deserve to hear Debbie's name. Now stay with us because this is the part where everything changes. In 2001, a detective named Morris Nix went looking through old cold case files. Nix was not approaching this from any kind of professional distance. He was a lifelong Marietta resident who had been young when Debbie disappeared. Old enough to remember exactly what those 16 days did to this community. Old enough to remember his mother telling him to stay inside. Old enough to remember the adults around him speaking in lowered voices. The way the neighborhood felt different after. Like something invisible had been taken from the air itself and never fully put back. When Morris Nix opened that evidence box, what he felt was not professional curiosity. It was something older than that. Something personal. He sent the preserved hair to the FBI for testing. The results came back with a partial DNA profile. White male. Consistent with the original 1972 lab findings. Investigators ran it against every available database. Nothing came back. The man who killed Debbie Lynn Randall had no DNA on record anywhere in the system. The profile existed, but it pointed at a ghost. A biological description with no name attached. The technology simply was not ready for what this case needed. Nix put the evidence back, closed the box, and waited for the world to catch up. In March of 2015, Cobb County built something new. A cold case unit dedicated entirely to revisiting unsolved cases with fresh eyes and updated science. In its first 2 years alone, the unit secured 8 arrests and 6 criminal prosecutions from cases that had been sitting cold for years. Morris Nix came back. He brought Debbie's file with him. This time attention turned to the small circular cloth. It had spent more than 40 years sitting in that evidence box, holding on to something it had never once been asked to give. The cloth was sent to a forensic laboratory for updated DNA analysis. A partial male profile came back. Investigators ran it through CODIS, the National Combined DNA Index System containing genetic profiles from convicted offenders across the entire country. If this man had ever been arrested and processed anywhere in America, the system would find him. The search came back completely empty. After 43 years of waiting, after carefully preserved evidence and FBI testing and a brand new cold case unit with a proven track record, the killer had still never once put himself in the system. He had lived his entire life without leaving a criminal record serious enough to flag him anywhere. The cloth went back into storage. And the case went quiet again. Then in October of 2021, the District Attorney's Office received new federal funding. A Bureau of Justice grant allocated specifically for cold case work. And that money unlocked something that had not existed as a viable investigative tool even 5 years before that moment. Genetic genealogy. The concept works like this. You are no longer searching for the killer himself. You are searching for his blood. Somewhere out there, a relative of the man who killed Debbie Lynn Randall had voluntarily uploaded their own DNA to a public ancestry website. They did it to find cousins. To trace their family history. To see where their people came from. They had absolutely no idea that a piece of cloth from a 1972 crime scene in Marietta, Georgia was about to find them. In 2022, the cloth was sent to DNA Labs International, a forensic laboratory based in Florida. Their task was to build a SNP profile detailed enough to cast a net across millions of publicly available genetic records and pull out any thread, however distant, that connected back to the DNA recovered from that cloth. Somewhere in a database full of ordinary people tracing their family trees, there was a genetic breadcrumb that led directly back to a murderer. Investigators were going to follow it one relative at a time. Building a family tree branch by branch, generation by generation, until they arrived at a name. The cloth had waited 50 years in the dark. It already knew exactly who put it there. In 2023 it finally told someone. What followed was painstaking, methodical, deeply human work. Genetic genealogy does not hand you a name the moment you start. What investigators received first was a familial connection. A partial genetic overlap suggesting that someone in the database was related to whoever contributed the DNA found on that cloth. Not the killer himself. A relative. Possibly a distant one who had never once heard the name Debbie Randall and had no idea what their family tree was about to reveal. From that single connection, investigators began constructing a family tree entirely by hand. Branch by branch. Generation by generation. Cross-referencing public records, census data, marriage records, and death certificates to map out who was related to whom and how far back those relationships stretched. The goal was to work inward from the outside. Start with the relative who had uploaded their DNA. Trace the family lines backward and sideways and gradually narrow the circle down to a single specific individual matching the profile established by the original forensic evidence. White male. Likely between 18 and 30 years old, in January of 1972. Connected in some way to the Marietta apartment complex where the Randall family lived. The tree kept growing. The circle kept narrowing. Then a name emerged. William B. Rose. Mableton, Georgia. 24 years old on the 13th of January 1972. Investigators ran his name through every available record they had access to. And the first thing that stopped them in their tracks was something they had not expected at all. William B. Rose had never once been a suspect in this case. Not in 1972 when the original investigation was running full force. Not in 2001 when Morris Nix reopened the file and sent the hair to the FBI. Not in 2015 when the cold case unit took another run at it. Not once in 51 years had his name appeared anywhere in the investigation. He had lived in complete invisibility right next to the truth the entire time. His criminal record offered almost nothing that would have ever raised a flag. A handful of alcohol-related arrests. No violence on record. No history that would have drawn any investigator's attention in any era. To everyone who knew him, William Rose was simply a young man from Mableton with a drinking problem and a quiet life. Nothing more than that. But here is the connection that explained everything and nothing at the same time. Rose had family members who lived in the same apartment complex as the Randall family. He had been there before the night of the 13th of January. Possibly many times. Investigator Ron Alter later noted that children in that complex frequently played outside where they could be seen from the parking areas and surrounding streets. William Rose had likely seen Debbie Randall before. Probably more than once. He knew the area. He understood the rhythms of the place. The timing of when people came and went. And on the evening of the 13th of January 1972, when a 9-year-old girl in Lavender's shoes walked out of a laundromat alone and turned toward home, he saw an opportunity. Not a plan worked out in advance. Not a premeditated target selected over time. An opportunity. A window that opened for a few minutes on an ordinary street in a town where nobody was expecting anything to go wrong. That is what makes this case sit so heavily even now. Debbie Randall was not chosen because of who she was. She was chosen because of when she was there. A matter of minutes. A matter of being in the wrong place at the precise moment a dangerous man happened to be watching from a dark truck at the curb. There was one significant problem with making the case official. William B. Rose was already dead. He had taken his own life in 1974. Just 2 years after Debbie's murder. He was 26 years old. And according to conversations that investigator Ron Alter had with Rose's surviving family members, Rose had been visibly and deeply afraid in the period leading up to his death. Afraid of going to jail. Anxious and unsettled in a way that his family struggled to explain because they assumed his fear was tied to his minor alcohol-related incidents. They had absolutely no idea what he was actually carrying. What he had actually done. What was eating him from the inside. Alter's assessment was direct and clear. Rose had likely convinced himself that investigators were closing in on him. Whether that was actually true at that point or simply a paranoia born entirely from guilt, nobody alive today can say for certain. What is certain is that William Rose chose to end his life before he could ever be made to face what he had done. He almost took the truth with him into the ground. Almost. Before any public announcement could be made, investigators needed absolute confirmation. The familial DNA match was strong. The circumstantial connections were compelling and well documented. But strong and compelling are not the same thing as confirmed. And in a case this old with a family that had been waiting this long, confirmed was the only standard that would ever be acceptable. With the full cooperation and blessing of Rose's surviving family, who had no prior knowledge of his involvement and were completely devastated by what they were slowly learning his body was exhumed. Direct DNA samples were taken and compared against the genetic profile that had been sitting on that small piece of cloth since 1972. The match was exact. William B. Rose was the man who abducted, assaulted, and murdered Debbie Lynn Randall. Not probably. Not likely. Not circumstantially. Confirmed by science that did not exist when he committed the crime and did not exist when he died believing he had escaped it. The 18th of September 2023. Cobb County, Georgia. District Attorney Flynn D. Brody Jr. stepped to the podium and said this. The loss of a loved one, especially one of such a tender age, is difficult to comprehend. This family has waited for decades for an answer. This information will not replace the pain of losing Debbie Lynn. Then Morris Nix stepped forward and said the words that will stay with everyone who heard them. Technology does not get old. It does not retire. It does not get sick. And it does not quit. Technology was seeking William Rose and it found him in the grave. 51 years. One piece of cloth. One man who was certain he had gotten away with everything. He had not. But the hardest part of this story is not the science. It is not the investigation or the cold case unit or the genetic genealogy or the exhumation. The hardest part is who was not in that room on the 18th of September 2023 to hear the answer finally spoken out loud. Juanita Randall spent the final years of her life battling leukemia. In July of 2018, even while sick and weakening, she gave an interview. She said 5 words that will stay with you once you hear them. I would at least like to know who done it before I pass away. She did not get that. Juanita Randall died on the 17th of September 2018. One single day before the date that 5 years later would finally hold the answer she spent her whole life searching for. In accordance with her wishes, her ashes were buried alongside Debbie's body at Kentstone Memorial Park. Because even in death she could not bear to be apart from her daughter. The answer came 5 years too late for her. John Randall held on longer. He kept every newspaper clipping. Gave interviews wherever he could. Kept talking because he kept believing that justice would find its way back to him while he was still alive to witness it. John Randall died in January of 2022. 3 days before the 50th anniversary of Debbie's murder. At that very moment the piece of cloth was already sitting in a laboratory in Florida. Already being analyzed. Already pulling genetic threads that led directly to the man who had taken his daughter 50 years before. 3 days. 50 years of waiting. And he missed the answer by less than 2 years. There are simply no words adequate for that. But there was one person in that room on the 18th of September 2023 who had been waiting for that exact moment for 51 years. Not a detective. Not a prosecutor. Not a forensic scientist. A grandfather. Melvin Randall stood at that press conference with gray in his hair and a lifetime visible behind his eyes. He was 10 years old when his sister disappeared. He was sick in bed that evening. He stayed home. And for decades after, through his teenage years, through raising his own children, through becoming a grandfather of 2, that one fact had never stopped finding him. He was supposed to be there. He was not. And she was gone. When Melvin spoke, he did not speak like a man consumed by unresolved grief. He spoke like a man who had done the long, hard, invisible work of making peace with something that never fully deserved to be made peace with. He said this. After a while I blamed myself. I was her big brother. I battled with it for a long time. But then I realized there was nothing I could have done. It just happened. And it was not my fault. Those words did not come free. You do not arrive at that kind of clarity without first passing through years of darkness so heavy most people would not have survived it. But what Melvin said next is the part that will stop you where you stand. He forgave William B. Rose. Not because what Rose did was forgivable. Not because 51 years had somehow erased the weight of what was taken. But because Melvin Randall had learned the hard way over the long, slow passage of a lifetime that carrying hatred only keeps hurting the person carrying it. He said this. I learned over the years. Hate does not do you no good. Holding grudges does not do you no good. And then he turned his attention to Rose's surviving family. The people who had cooperated fully with investigators. Who had given their own DNA without hesitation. Who had agreed to the exhumation of someone they had loved. Who had spent their entire lives not knowing what the man sitting at their dinner table had once done. Melvin looked toward them and said this. I want them to know I have no animosity toward them. No hatred. I wish them all the best. We will be praying for them. 2. A man who lost his sister when he was 10 years old. Praying for the family of the man who took her. There is no script in the world for that kind of grace. After Debbie was murdered in 1972, a woman named Joyce Dunaway Parker looked at what had happened to this community and decided that something had to be built from the wreckage. She founded the Cobb Marietta Girls Club, a nonprofit created specifically to give the city's young girls a safe space to belong. A place to go. A place to matter. That organization eventually became part of Girls Incorporated. A national network empowering young women across the entire country. It exists in part because Debbie Lynn Randall existed. Because her death made one woman refuse to let the fear have the final word. The 19th of October 2023. 1 month after William Rose was publicly named as Debbie's killer. Outside the Girls Inc. building on Mill Street in Marietta, just a few blocks from where Debbie was last seen alive, a crowd gathered. The Debbie Lynn Randall Memorial Butterfly Garden was being dedicated that morning. Students from the Marietta Center for Advanced Academics had painted every stone that lined it by hand. Retired law enforcement stood in the crowd. Morris Nix was there. District Attorney Brody was there. And Melvin Randall was there. He stood in front of that garden and looked at the painted stones and the flowers and the faces of the people who had come from all over just to say out loud that his sister mattered. And something in him that had been held tightly for 51 years finally gave way. He said this. "Y'all brought a big man like myself to my knees today." Then they released the butterflies. Scores of them rising up into the Marietta sky. Spreading out over the street and the trees and the rooftops of the neighborhood where a 9-year-old girl once walked to a laundromat in her brand new lavender shoes thinking she was simply going home. Melvin Randall watched every single one of them go. Debbie Lynn Randall was 9 years old. She loved dolls and baseball and her brother Melvin. She had freckles and a laugh that the people who knew her never forgot and could not describe without smiling. She walked out of a laundromat on an ordinary Thursday evening in January 1972 and the world took 51 years to answer what came next. Her parents died waiting for that answer. Her brother carried the guilt of a sick day for half a century. And the man who took her shoes thought he had taken everything from her. He had not. Because 51 years later on a warm October morning in Marietta, Georgia, scores of butterflies rose into the sky in her name. Her killer was in the ground. Her brother was on his knees in gratitude. And Debbie Lynn Randall, the freckle-faced third grader from Pine Forest Elementary who lit up every room she ever walked into, was finally after all this time at peace. Justice has no expiration date. It just sometimes arrives too late for the people who deserve to witness it most. Before you go tonight, we want to hear from you. Do you believe Melvin's forgiveness toward Rose's family was the right thing to do, or is some pain simply too deep for forgiveness? If you were Juanita or John, would the not knowing have broken you completely? And do you believe justice truly means something when the person responsible never faced a single day in a courtroom? Drop your answer in the comments right now. We want to know what you think. And if this story moved you tonight, please share this video with one person before you close it. Not for us. For Melvin. For Juanita. For John. For the little girl in the lavender shoes who deserved to make it home. Hit the like button. Subscribe to Midnight Crime 247 if you have not already. And we will see you at midnight for the next one.